But the House and Senate have both passed budget resolutions that take a longer look, and they're considering extending very expensive tax cuts and how or whether to pay for them. And I could get your take on that, but this is a little bit in the weeds, but it's an important discussion that I think we're going to have, which is what is the baseline? I mean, we talk about cuts.
Yep.
Cuts from what? And so, I mean, CBO, you were director of CBO, so this is why I'm asking you this, produces a baseline. Now, in this case, we have a current law baseline, which CBO uses, and that assumes that everything goes according to current law, which means that the tax cuts, a lot of the tax cuts that were enacted in 2017 expire at the end of this
Right.
year. So CBO counts kind of a revenue gusher coming in 2026 and beyond, assuming that those expirations happen. And then other people say, look, that was just a budget gimmick when it was enacted. We should go with a current policy baseline, which assumes that those tax cuts are extended because that's what everybody really intended in the first place. And so if you do that, I mean, the difference is if you're going with a current law baseline, then if you're going to extend them, it comes as a deficit increase. Whereas if you go with the current policy, it doesn't show as a deficit increase. What are your thoughts about baseline selections and games?
So Bob, let me make a general point and then a specific point. The general point is that CBO's processes were set up to serve the Congress. And so it's very natural for CBO to say to Congress, if you, the Congress, don't do anything, here's what will happen with the budget. And then when people in Congress propose to do X or Y, CBO says, well, those proposals would have the following effects on the budget relative to your not passing them, which would be the current law baseline. So only the current law baseline makes logical sense as a baseline. Current policy baseline would require somebody to say, well, Congress didn't actually vote for something to be permanent, but nonetheless, CBO should assume that it's permanent. Well, who's going to decide that? Congress didn't vote to make it permanent. They're going to vote to pretend the CBO should pretend it's permanent. CBO is going to decide what Congress really meant to be permanent. And then if Congress doesn't do the thing that you expect them to do, then I mean, the whole thing becomes I think, an impossible hall of mirrors if you try to go to a current policy baseline. But then the specific point is that when the 2017 tax cuts were enacted, they were deliberately not enacted to be permanent. Now, not everybody liked that deliberateness, but that was meeting the Senate rule that said that if you want to pass something through this process of reconciliation, which is to say you can pass with only 50 votes, you don't need to overcome a filibuster, that something passed in reconciliation can't make the deficit worse in the long term. So to get that through the Senate required it to be temporary, required the matter to be revisited now. And so you can't then decide, well, we had to pass it, we had to say it was temporary, but now you all know we were kidding. And some people wanted it to be permanent all along. Some didn't want it at all. There's a whole range of views. That's fine. That's why the Congress has to revisit it today. And you can't fake your way out of that.
So I mean, basically it's a trade-off. If you want to use the reconciliation process, that's fine to avoid a filibuster. And the trade-off is that you have to make things temporary because it doesn't affect the deficit over the long term.
Yes. And the other point to make here is that at the end of the day, if the tax cuts are extended, and I expect most of them will be, and there'll be some savings through spending cuts, but not as much as the loss of tax revenue relative to current law, then we'll find deficits going forward that'll be very large. And however you define the baseline today, if you wake up in 2026 and the tax cuts have been extended and the spending's been cut to some extent, you're going to have even bigger deficits than the ones that CBO now projects. However you run the process or define the terms.
Right. Yeah. The bottom line numbers don't change. It's just the how
Right.
you define them. I guess how you define how you got there.